I'd like to, if you have your Bibles, to go ahead and turn with me to Daniel chapter 3. This was actually one of the lessons I was going to preach to you this past Sunday, but obviously things had kind of been delayed. Again, Daniel chapter 3. And this evening we're going to be speaking about three individuals. And throughout this lesson, I'm just going to refer to them oftentimes as Daniel's friends. We know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we're going to read about these men and study about them as they go through a time where truly their faith is going to be tested by the great king. We might say literally that their faith will be tested with fire. And we're going to see that these men tonight are men who are living in a world that is quite like ours. A world that preaches tolerance towards all things, but yet concerning the Most High God, they are so often intolerant. And you might remember, not this past Sunday, but the Sunday before, we had been looking at Daniel chapter 2 in the evening, and we came to see Nebuchadnezzar, this great king who had a dream. And none of his men were able to interpret. None of them were able to even to tell him what the dream was. But yet Daniel, by the power of God, was able to reveal both the dream and the interpretation. That's something that we need to remember because Nebuchadnezzar has been able to witness the power of God. At the end of Daniel chapter 2, we saw just how much Nebuchadnezzar himself paid homage to Daniel and the God that he served. All focus was then directed on the Lord our God. As we get to chapter 3 this evening, what we come to find is that that was very short-lived. We don't know how many years has passed since that time, but now all focus, all glory, all praise is going to be on Nebuchadnezzar and what he has done. And when we get to chapter 3, we come to find Nebuchadnezzar, and we're not going to be reading throughout all this text this evening, but Nebuchadnezzar has set up a statue. Constantly throughout this chapter, you're going to see the image that he set up. Remember that. It's a statue that's 60 cubits high, it's 6 cubits wide, it's massive. And throughout this time, why not? If you want everyone to focus on you and what you've done, set it up on a plane where everyone can see it. Invite all the people, all the leaders, the rulers, the judges, the different people around who are lower in authority than him, but still authoritative people that could come out and see the dedication of this great statue. And when we come to find not only this, but to make this great presentation, this concert-like thing happens where all the music plays, all these different instruments. And the very next thing he calls for them to do is for everyone, no exceptions, every single person is to bow before the image, to worship it. Now there's a couple of things that we need to take with this. When we're speaking about the image that he set up, for one, this shows that all desire, all emphasis is on him. Look what he has done. This man who so recently had recognized the power of God seems to have forgotten it so soon. And now he wants everyone to submit to his will, to focus on what he has done, despite the fact that it may cause some individuals to go against their faith who worship the God in heaven. But there's something else we need to notice when we're speaking about this. The fact that the image is what he set up. It shows us that this is something that he had to make, this golden image. It is something that is not just idol worship, but it shows that man had to create it. In fact, what often happens when man rejects the God of heaven is that in one way or another, they end up making their own. And they serve their own gods. Sometimes we see in the case of people today, they worship their own minds. Some worship their own lust and passions and desires. But we have one like Nebuchadnezzar who has built a statue made of gold that everyone is to worship, including himself. He worships false gods. And you might remember in Psalm 115, we often speak of this as the folly of idols. In Psalm 115 in verse 2, it says, "Wherefore should the heathen say, Where is now their God? But our God is in the heavens, he hath done whatsoever he hath pleased. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of men's hands. They have mouths, but they speak not. Eyes have they, but they see not. They have ears, but they hear not. Noses have they, but they smell not. They have hands, but they handle not. Feet have they, but they walk not, neither speak they through their throat. They that make them are like unto them, so is everyone that trusteth in them. That's the reality. When we speak about idols, it is the work of man's hands, and you might question, how foolish would it be to worship something that I have created, as Nebuchadnezzar has done, and he expects all to worship it. We understand that idols cannot do anything. Throughout the Bible, we read of them in a manner where men had to make them, they had to carry them, they had to lift them up. They were not able to teach or to do anything. In fact, what an idol teaches is coming from man. It is man's teachings, unlike our God, who we know is in heaven, our God who has revealed His word to man. But we also might question something. It makes me wonder when studying through the text of Daniel chapter 3, just how many men, how many exiles from Judah might have submitted to this decree of the king out of fear. Because we know not only were there men and women from Judah at this time, but the decree went out not only to worship the idol, but that if you refused to, you were going to be thrown into the fiery furnace. You were going to be put to death. And we know that some of these people, in fact, you could imagine this great sea of people, there were a few individuals that we're going to mention tonight who refused to submit to that decree. And when we speak about Nebuchadnezzar, he was clearly a man who had no problem with putting anyone to death. He was not bluffing. In the book of Jeremiah, I know I mentioned this in the past, but it speaks about Nebuchadnezzar, who is one who had men roasted in the fire. He is willing to put anyone to death who does not submit to his will, does not focus on him and give him all glory and praise and honor. And I think most of us here are probably familiar with how this event goes. But we might mention a couple of things. We understand those who refuse to do this, most certainly they would be put to death. But I want to mention something. I mentioned just a moment ago, there's a few individuals who refused to do this. We're going to come to find there were some Chaldeans there who took this opportunity to tell on those three different Jews. We will come to find, well, they not only bring charges against the Jews, but they're going to come and they're going to kind of flatter the king, saying, oh king, live forever. And they remind this king of the decree that he's made for all the people, when they hear this music, to bow down and to worship the image. And that those who would refuse to do so, they were to be cast into the fiery furnace. And now notice, if you would, if you have your Bibles, in verse 12. Again, in Daniel chapter 3 and verse 12, he starts off, there are certain Jews. The Chaldean said, there are certain Jews. Now, I have a hard time reading that part of this text without seeing this like they are viewing the Jews with contempt, with hatred. And you might question why. We'll mention that here in just a moment. But he says, there are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon. Remember that right there. Namely, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. You notice throughout this, they are telling, there are certain Jews that you have put up in this position. And why not? If you're jealous of them, if you've seen the position they've been giving, seek the opportunity. And we see this. Even later on in Daniel in chapter 6, you're going to see those who seem to be jealous of Daniel, and they found an opportunity where they could have him put to death. They could have him done away with. That seems to be what we're seeing right here as well. But as we move on in this lesson, we might consider something. We know that these men most certainly will be put to death. But isn't it interesting how we see three individuals, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who in a time where there's a powerful nation, a powerful kingdom, if you would, with the greatest king on earth, that these men were willing to show boldness, to show courage, to show trust and faith in God, that despite the fact that everyone else Every other person that we would think of has bowed to the image. These three individuals stood out from the crowd. They refused to submit to this. And let me ask you a question. When we reflect on this in our lives as Christians, as individuals, how do we fare in this, in our day and time? Do we find ourselves lacking these traits of boldness and courage? Maybe just when it comes to us speaking to our neighbors about the gospel. Maybe just when it comes to speaking to our friends. Simple things like that. Or what about when it comes to those that we know need to hear about the Lord? Maybe what about when it comes to the fact that we need to be living for the Lord before those who are not Christians? We live in a world exactly like theirs. A world, not a world that has Babylon, but a world that proclaims tolerance towards sins and all things against God, and they do not tolerate what comes from the Most High God. And that is what we see as we go throughout the book of Daniel. And people might question, when it comes to us and it comes to things that we face in our lives, that, at work I don't want to be seen as the do-gooder, the person who is living for God and doing those things, and I need to fit in. I want my boss to respect me and like me, so when he asks us to go out for drinks, I go out. That way I can fit in and my work will go better for me. Have you been in situations like that? Have you been in situations where maybe individuals at work, they want you to conform to their ways of living, to things that are sinful? And they might be looking at pictures of things that are immodest, things that are not, we know that are sinful. And yet one individual thinks, well, I know it's wrong, but I need to fit in with the guys so work can go better for me and we'll all get along. And that way, you don't know how hard it will be if they're all against me. I think what oftentimes happens, even for us as Christians, if we're not careful, is that we look at the circumstance right there, right now, and we consider what kind of effect will that specific circumstance have on us. Sometimes people question or they think, well, maybe I can just sin this time and then later on, I can pray for forgiveness. We need to be concerned as Christians, pleasing God right near, right now, all the time, always seeking to do the will of God no matter the cost. No matter what we see with those like Nebuchadnezzar, with what he has called for them to do. But you live in a world, again, just like theirs, where many people, they are preaching tolerance, proclaiming that we need to tolerate sin, that we need to accept it. A world who says you just need to love, and then we will have unity and we will have peace. The devil believes the exact same thing, or he wants us to believe the exact same thing. Remember that. And we might question, as Christians, we need to be careful, for one, about how we approach these things. How many people, as we mentioned, will preach tolerance? But yet, when it comes to someone proclaiming about the Most High God, they are no longer tolerant. In fact, today it's very common to see things like homosexuality and other sins commonly glorified and portrayed in a great manner. And yet you see an individual out in public who has been praying with others, and that person is slandered and ridiculed just because they are living for God. Someone comes along and questions, don't push your faith on me. You see this. I remember in the past, a football player, Tim Tebow. Some of you are probably familiar with him. All he had done, and I don't think he was doing this with the purpose of being seen, but praying to God. And yet, what often happened, the comments you read towards this man were often a lot of slander, ridicule, people thinking that he is pushing his faith on them. It was a man, though, who's just striving to pray to God. Nothing more. How many times do you see today, or do you hear today, maybe in the school systems, where they are constantly promoting and teaching lies and sinful things? Evolution is one of the biggest lies that's ever been propagated. And you see how many school systems teach the kids that this is fact, that you need to believe it, They proclaim to the teenagers that it's okay to do other things like sensual sins. They say they're just going to do it anyway. So they provide a means that will help them to not have unwanted pregnancies and other things. You see, the world proclaims sin and tolerates sin. But at the same time, in some school systems today, what you're finding, a child brings a Bible to school, and they're told they need to leave it at home, that it doesn't belong there. You see how our society can completely turn against God because they promote what is against God and they reject what comes from the Lord. If we would accept what comes from the Lord and reject the other, you would see such a great transformation in our society. And it reminds me, just recently, I'll mention one more thing before we move on in this lesson. Recently, I made a comment somewhere on the internet because there was something that was posted. They were glorifying and bragging about this event that was coming up, this voting for homosexual marriages over in England. And I made a comment. All I did was quote from the book of Matthew, the words of Jesus Christ, as he mentioned the marriage that God ordained from the beginning of a man leaving his father and mother and being joined to his wife. And yet that passage that I quoted was immediately removed because it did not fit their agenda. You see, again, how the world tolerates and promotes sins, but they will reject the words of Jesus Christ. And yet, but as we continue on, I might mention with that, isn't it interesting? Doesn't it seem so fitting, the words that we read in the Apostle Peter's letter? Over later on in the New Testament, as he even mentioned, that they are surprised that you do not run with them to the same excess of riot. They're basically surprised you don't run with the crowd. And they slander you. We have to understand, we have to remember as Christians that we must stand out from the crowd and do what's right no matter the cost. Not stand with the crowd, not follow the crowd, but we live for God no matter what the situation. And I want us to think of these three men tonight that we're talking about ultimately. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Three men that to me have set one of the greatest examples that we ever read about in the entire Bible. Because I want you to imagine this picture. As we've talked about earlier, all these people have been invited out to this event, the dedication of this statue, a false god. Great rulers, leaders, judges, others, a massive sea of people would have been there. And yet at the sound of this music that was played, everyone bows down to worship the image, except for three individuals. If you want to speak about people who were willing to not run with the crowd, individuals who are willing to do what is right when no one else would, that's it. Those men right there showed true faith, true courage, and conviction in the truth, to live for God no matter the cost. And yet we understand, if you're familiar with this event, this time, we know that the situation was about to get more intense. Because Nebuchadnezzar in his rage, he's going to have them come before him. What would you feel like? How would you feel if you were going face to face before the greatest earthly king in the world and the most powerful empire at that time, one who has already said if you reject his command, he's going to put you to death? How would you feel? Would we still have the courage, the boldness that those individuals had just a moment ago? And we know, if you're familiar with this, Nebuchadnezzar, he gives them the chance again. He questions them as if if you had not done this, but he gives them one more opportunity to bow before this image, to make it right to him in his eyes. But I want us to notice something that he has said. Because oftentimes what we see with Nebuchadnezzar, this man who fails to recognize so often the fact that his majesty, his sovereignty was given to him by God. He so often fails to recognize that, and he exalts himself not only above other people, but above the God of heaven. Notice, if you would, down in this text, in verse 15, he says, "Now if you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made. Very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. Now notice, and what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? And if you want to see a man who has exalted himself above everything, a man who has exalted himself even above the God of heaven, their God, our God, Nebuchadnezzar has done it. And he is going to get his answer here in just a moment. What God can deliver them, he will find out. And he's going to find out how will these men fare in their response. How will they stand against him at this time? Will they submit to the wrath and the threat of the king and the threat of fire? So look with me, if you would, if you have your Bibles, down in chapter 3 and verse 16. It says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. When we look at these verses, these are some of the most powerful verses that we see in the Bible. It doesn't matter what threat is given to them. No threat of man, no threat of fire. Nothing in the world is going to make them stray against their convictions and their faith and their trust in God to do what is right, no matter the cost. Even if God does not deliver them, if he chooses not to, they are not going to worship the image. They are not going to sin against their God. This is one of the most remarkable answers. This is one of the most remarkable tests, I will say, that we see throughout history. And the answer that they give stands the test of time. These men have an unshakable faith. It will not waver. They will not sin against their God, no matter what man will do to them. And there's a few things that we might consider with this. With us, even as Christians, as we look at this example, how they are only going to serve God, God alone. How we as Christians, and I'm not going to lie to you when it comes to this, when it comes to anything, but when we speak about something that is sinful, maybe not in this case, but what we see in our own lives, there are going to be times where maybe, yes, they pressure you to sin. They may threaten you with consequences. There are going to be times in your lives where there are things that are sinful. They might look very inviting, very pleasing, maybe satisfactory for the time. And it could be hard for an individual to say no. But we have to remember something as a Christian. Just as we see with these men, whom they serve no matter the cost, just as Jesus himself is quoted from the Old Testament when Satan wanted him to fall before him, that it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God and serve him only. He is the only one we serve. We don't serve sin. We don't serve man. In that sense, we as Christians serve the Lord alone. And we have to remember that what we choose to serve in this life, if I as a Christian choose that I'm going to start serving sin, then I have chosen what I'm going to obey. You remember Paul as he wrote to the Romans, in Romans chapter 6 and verse 16. He said, do you not know that when you present yourselves to someone as slaves for obedience, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin resulting in death or of obedience resulting in righteousness? We might consider, despite the fact maybe someone wants you to sin because of a threat, maybe someone wants you to sin, maybe it's something that looks inviting, whatever it is, remember that when we choose the path of sin, we've chosen to become slaves of sin. We need to, as Christians, make the choice that we will obey God no matter the cost. But I want us to remember, if you have studied through this text before, and I think most of you are very familiar with this, we're going to come to find Nebuchadnezzar, he doesn't take this very lightly when these men have rejected his decree. In fact, he's going to have the furnace heated 7 times hotter than normal. And it would seem that there's absolutely no hope. Remember, as I go through this next part, if we are looking at this in the eyes of man who does not believe in the Most High God, it would look as if there is no hope. Because he has ordered it not only 7 times hotter, he has his warriors take these 3 individuals and throws them into the fire. And those warriors were actually killed in the process. And someone would see that and they would think, there's absolutely no way. There is no way that these men could survive. They are destined to perish. If we are looking at this again in the eyes of man who disbelieves in the Most High God. Just as Nebuchadnezzar does not seem to recognize, does not seem to believe at this time that there is a God who can deliver them. But I think we know what happens. You remember how we read and studied this passage. I know many of you studied it time and time again. It's one of the most familiar events, the familiar truths that we've ever read over and over again. They threw 3 men into the fire. They were tied together. Do you remember how many were walking in the fire? 3 men bound together by the rope, thrown into the fire. And yet, in the midst of the fire, 4 men walk, freed from these bonds. Remember that. Nebuchadnezzar thought this was one like the son of the gods. In fact, later on, he thinks it's an angelic being. Something to understand with that, despite who you may believe that to be. It shows the Lord's presence is with these men through the fire. And he has delivered them. God delivered his people from the fire. Remember that, as we're going to mention more about that in just a moment. But what's so remarkable in this time, and I'm not going to read the rest of the text at this moment, but Nebuchadnezzar was one who came to recognize that God was able to deliver these men. He got his answer. Nebuchadnezzar even made orders that the God they served, no one is to speak against that God, or they will be put to death. And it shows you he has come once again to see and to witness the power of the Most High God. And you're going to see that time and time again. Not only from him, but even other kings as we go throughout the book of Daniel in these studies. And it's such a simple event. I don't like to call it a story because it's truth. But it's such a simple thing, but yet it shows such power. So much things that we can take and apply to our lives, and we can see that encourage us as Christians. To see these 3 individuals, when they are questioned, when they are asked to conform to the world, when everyone else is doing what is wrong, they made the choice that they're going to stand out and they're going to do what's right no matter the cost. They serve God and God alone. So we might question, as we come closer to the end, there's a couple of things we're going to mention for the application, and then the lesson will be yours. We might question, what do we learn from this? What do we learn from this event, this time where we see these 3 men and the actions that they have portrayed? You know, there is no doubt in our lives as Christians that there will be times where maybe just from your boss, from someone you work for, they may want you to do something that is sinful. And if you refuse to, they will threaten you with consequences. It happens. We look at that and we look back at these men and their example tonight and how the choices that they made. We look back and it makes us think even of our studies in the book of Revelation, because you see first century Christians, because they were faithful to Jesus Christ and Him alone, many of them became martyrs. They were put to death by the Roman Empire. We see this even in our day and time, overseas. If you have a TV, if you've ever watched the news, you have seen this. The terrorist group ISIS, who in the name of their false god, in the name of their false prophet, Allah and Muhammad, they give those who profess to be of Christ an ultimatum. That you submit to them or you will be crucified or executed. The goal of all these individuals, whether it is Babylon, whether it is the Romans or ISIS, any of them, is to strike fear into the hearts of every individual. Remember that. But there's something that everyone needs to remember. Us as Christians, we need to remember this truthfully. We need to let those, whether ISIS or anyone, if it comes to it one day that they are here, they need to know this is what we believe. Not only the example we've seen tonight, that we serve God alone, but the words of Jesus Christ. In fact, if you remember in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 28, He said, "Do not fear those who kill the body, but are unable to kill the soul, but rather fear God, who is able to destroy both body and soul in hell." Remember that. We as Christians, we do not need to be concerned about whether or not we are pleasing man. We need to be concerned about whether or not we are giving reverence to God. Because man may be able to do something to you. They may be able to threaten you. They may be able to give you consequences. In fact, some in other countries, and as we have read and studied throughout the Bible, have put Christians to death because of their faith. But it doesn't matter in one sense. They may be able to harm the body, but they do not have power over the soul. God does. Why not, as Christians, give reverence and obedience and the desire to serve to the one who has power over our souls? He is the one who can save us. He is the one who will protect us. But we also need to understand, there's a few things that we need to learn from all this. For one, when we face these kinds of trials and tribulations in our life, when we are tested by the fire, so to speak, spiritually, there's a few things that this does for us. For one, these things will shape us as Christians. Paul had written in Romans chapter 5, in verse 3, he said, "And not only this, but we also exult in our tribulations, knowing that tribulations brings about perseverance, and perseverance, proven character, and proven character, hope." You know, we think about the trials of this life, the tribulations. These are the things that, yes, they will shape us. Sometimes, if we are not relying on God, if we are not seeking His strength and going to Him, yes, they can shape us for the worse. We can end up going away from God. But if we will look to God and we will seek Him, you see how these things can result in the betterment of us as Christians. As Paul mentioned again in that text, that tribulation brings about perseverance. When we speak of perseverance, it shows this idea that we have gone through difficult times, trials, tribulations, distress, and we've conquered them, and we've come out stronger. That's what perseverance shows. And that is what will happen if we as Christians will not rely on our own strength, but we will rely on the Most High God, the one who will deliver us and get us through the fire. That is how we will overcome, and we become stronger. It brings about character. It brings about hope. These other things, we'll mention one of those here in just a moment. But some of us in our lives, we may find ourselves thinking, how can these things actually shape us for the better? But we might think about a time where maybe an individual has gone through a problem with their boss, and if I don't do this and I know it's sinful, my boss may cut my pay, and I need that extra pay right now to kind of support myself. And so I'm just going to do it this time. I'll ask for forgiveness later. I'll do it, whatever. Some people look at situations like that and they wonder again, how can this shape me for the better? When I see something so horrible, so distressful, how can I get through this? Again, we need to be looking to this with the end goal in mind. With us, our lives, with God, that we please Him first, and that our goal, our journey in this life is to heaven. That's where we're focusing on. That's the end goal. That's where we're striving to go. And yet some people will, in their lives, they will just question, well, I'm not willing to suffer. I don't want to go through these things. I want to be accepted. I want to be loved by everyone. We as Christians, everyone wants to feel some type of acceptance and love in their lives. There's no doubt about that. But I want you to reflect on something here. We often talk about the Apostle Paul. You remember his life as a Christian because he made the choice that he was going to live for Jesus Christ. Because he made the choice that no matter the cost, he was going to seek to bring everyone he could to the truth. And he helped them as well as himself always strive to live, to stand in their convictions, no matter what was going to happen. And Paul faced a lot of persecution. In fact, he instructed us, he said, all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. He meant it because he faced it. He knew it. And we've seen through his life the things that he has suffered. As he was stoned and left for dead, as he was beaten, as he was, at one time had received 39 lashes 5 different times. And the list just goes on of things that Paul had suffered for the sake of Jesus Christ. And yet I worry about someone laughing about me. But when we look at these things and we say, well, that's very difficult. That's very hard. How can we get through these things and still live for God no matter the cost? Where are we looking to? What's our focus? What's the end goal? In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul showed us where his focus was. And he was able to, despite what I just mentioned about all those things he's faced, Paul was able to tell us that affliction is momentary and light. How could he do that? Despite the fact that what he's faced is so horrible, so tremendous. In fact, it's said in history that a couple of years, in about 68 AD, he was even beheaded. He was put to death. How could he do that? How could he look so to these afflictions as momentary and light? 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 17, he says, for momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory, far beyond all comparison. Notice, while we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen, for the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. The point is, Paul's focus was where it needed to be. He was not looking at the things here on earth. He was not looking to the temporal things. Understand, everything in this life that we see, persecution, sin, affliction, anything like that, treasures of this world, are all things that are temporal. Many of them are destined to perish with use. Persecutions will not last forever. But if we are looking to the things which are not seen, they are the things which are eternal, the things that will last forever. That is where we as Christians must keep our focus. No matter what it is, look to the things that are the eternal, focus on what God has given us. And there is no doubt, and we're just going to mention maybe 1 or 2 things just very briefly, and the lesson is yours. There is no doubt that we as Christians will face times in this life where we will be put through the fire. But there's something we need to remember. For one, God will be with us through the spiritual times, these trials and tribulations. He will be with us if we rest and we rely on His strength. And we must understand that if we as Christians will keep our faith in Him, if we stay faithful to God, He has promised us. He will protect us. You remember, and as Peter said in one of his letters in 1 Peter, concerning our inheritance, that is imperishable and undefiled and will not fade away, that's reserved in heaven for us, he said, who are protected by the power of God through faith for a salvation, ready to be revealed in the last time. The point is, if we are faithful to God, what we have, this salvation, what God offers us, He will protect it. And who better to protect us than the Most High God that we've seen protect those individuals this evening? God who can do anything. As long as we are faithful to Him, He will protect it. It makes me think of the song that we've started singing recently. One of the verses, it says, no power of hell, no scheme of man can ever pluck me from His hand. Till He returns or calls me home, here in the power of Christ I stand. So that's the thing we'll reflect on this evening as we close. Do you stand in the power of Christ? Are you living for Christ? Are you faithful to Christ? Knowing that if we are, nothing can take us away from our Lord. Understand that. But there's something we need to also ask this evening. for those here who may not be Christians. You know, in the event that we looked at this evening, we saw 3 men thrown into the fire. They were bound and thrown into the fire. And yet God delivered them. The same thing we must remember is that God, through His Son Jesus Christ, He sent Him to this world. For God so loved the world, that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. God sent His only begotten Son, the only one of His kind, to this world. Giving up His home in heaven, He came down like us. And yet He submitted His life to the will of God the Father, until the point that He willfully offered Himself up as a sacrifice on the cross. That is how Jesus Christ made it possible. That is how we too can be set free from the bonds of sin that the devil would like to entangle us in. Jesus Christ has paid the ransom. But the thing we must understand, if you have not yet become a Christian, you have not yet accessed that blood. Yes, God has paid the way, but in order for you to accept it, we must be baptized into His Son. That's when you will come in contact with the blood of Jesus Christ and forgiven of everything you have ever done in your life before that point. Maybe those here who are Christians, maybe you've gone back into the ways of the world. Maybe you found yourselves doing things against God when the whole world is just pressuring you to do it, and you've chosen the life of sin instead of God. We would encourage you this evening. We would pray for you. We will help you in any way we can. We would encourage you to respond to the gospel this evening while we stand and while we sing.